In discussing indeterminism in the brain, so far I have focused on amplification of microscopic to macroscopic randomness. However, macroscopic to microscopic causation can also occur in complex systems that operate far from thermodynamic equilibrium. Such so-called dissipative structures exchange energy with their environment, increasing entropy or disorder globally while potentially increasing organization locally. These two things don't contradict each other. Life does not violate the second law of thermodynamics overall, even when it increases organization locally. For example, a cell, or our body, or even our household will excrete or dispose of waste products or garbage. This might increase the messiness of the environment, but it will create more order inside the cell membrane, or inside our bodies, or inside the walls of our house. When several dissipative structures interact, as occurs within nested hierarchies of cooperating and competing neural circuits in the brain, nonlinear interactions can impose organization at the level of local neuronal activity that could not have been predicted on the basis of full knowledge of any subset of neural circuit activity in isolation. Nonlinear dynamic systems are chaotic and unpredictable in principle because global outcomes are dependent on initial or boundary conditions to such a degree that immeasurably small differences in those conditions can lead to radically different outcomes or trajectories of system development. One common nonlinear mechanism occurs when winner-take-all operations lead to the capturing of the entire information processing system by a random fluctuation at the level of an entire circuit. For example, should a burst from one neuronal subcircuit happen to arrive just by chance at neurons that realize a winner-take-all decision before a burst from another subcircuit, the winning information could come to dominate subsequent information processing at all levels for a period of time because it flushes new order into the system. Now, this all sounds rather abstract, so let me give you a metaphor from everyday life. Something analogous happens in winner-take-all social systems where, for example, one candidate wins by chance. For example, George Bush Jr. received more votes in Florida in 2000 essentially by accident because of faulty ballots in Palm Beach County. This was essentially an unpredictable and bizarre chance event caused by confusing ballots that led people to check the box for the wrong person. Bush was then effectively installed by Supreme Court Justice Scalia and others. This then led to the imposition of a new social order on the whole country and indeed even on planet Earth that effectively shut down, or at least tried to shut down, potential competitors and dictate the terms of future decisions carried out within the system. It's almost inconceivable to think of it now, but the mistaken votes of a few thousand senior citizens in Palm Beach County was effectively a random fluctuation that flushed in a new global order followed by 9/11 and the neoconservatives' many wars in Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya, and elsewhere aimed at bolstering the hegemony of this one indispensable nation. This was an example not only of microscopic to macroscopic causation, but also of macroscopic to microscopic causation. Yes, the random fluctuation of votes meant for Gore, but counted toward Buchanan, involved amplification from the local to the global. But once Bush Jr. was awarded the victory, he and Cheney and colleagues imposed a new order on the entire globe that altered everything afterwards. An even more extreme example of this kind of bottom-up, top-down causation would be Hitler. After World War I and the weakness and hyperinflation of the Weimar Republic, Germany was deeply unstable. You might say it had hit a point of criticality where a local fluctuation could easily be amplified up to a new global ordering. At the time, there were many wannabe leaders who wanted to lead the desperate folk out of the crisis. In normal times, such people get dampened down or ignored or thrown into prison. But these were not normal times. Society was, so to speak, on fire. And when you're desperate and the theater is filling with smoke and a man stands up and says, "I know the way out," you follow him if he seems certain because you're desperate to get out. You don't worry about niceties at that point. But when there were dozens of such people aiming to take control at the time, both on the left and the right, why did Hitler win out? He certainly didn't have to win out. That he did win out was a matter of great chance and contingency. What if he'd been required to serve his entire 5-year term in prison after his failed attempt to take over the government of Bavaria in November 1923, the so-called Beer Hall Putsch? Instead, some single person's brain probably decided that it was okay to let him out after just 9 months, during which he wrote Mein Kampf. What if he had gotten into the Vienna Academy of Fine Arts in 1907 or 1908, as was his dream as a young man? Here are some of his paintings from around this period. He was gifted enough at art that, had he been admitted, he would probably not have ended up trying to take over the whole world. Instead, his party, the Nazi Party, ended up being elected the majority party in 1932, even though Paul von Hindenburg defeated him for the Weimar presidency in that election. On January 30th, 1933, Hitler succeeded in his aim to rule Germany when Hindenburg, in a political and obviously foolish move, chose Hitler to become chancellor. Within short order, the top-down imposition of a new order began. The so-called Enabling Act of 1933 effectively gave Hitler dictatorial powers, and well, the rest is history. Okay, now let's return to the brain. There are times when you don't want a local disturbance or fluctuation to be able to flush a whole new order into brain processing. Sleep might be such a case, but there are other cases where you do want the brain to operate in a regime where a local fluctuation can flush a whole new order into the brain's information processing. For example, if a small thing suddenly moves in the visual field, it might be a predator, so you want to stop doing whatever you're doing and pay full attention to this potentially dangerous thing. In society and in the brain, especially when the system is operating in the domain of criticality, causation can be thought to be circular, as winner-take-all and other nonlinear attractor mechanisms impose global upon local causation. This imposition then constrains subsequent local neuronal behavior, which in turn realizes later local upon global causation by changing the dynamics of the circuits to which they belong, and so on. Neuronal criterial causation is really an example of such circular causation. Criteria might be set in a top-down manner at time t1, when these criteria are met non-deterministically via bottom-up variability at time t2, this solution biases subsequent future behavior in a downwardly causal manner. It's impossible to disentangle bottom-up from top-down causation in such a system. Central to the possibility of top-down causation in the brain must be mechanisms whereby an idea considered in working memory, such as, think of a female European politician, could then come to modulate synaptic weights such that just these criteria are implemented, which can then be realized by searching memory stores for information that meets these criteria. Then, just by chance, you might end up thinking of Theresa May or Margaret Thatcher or Angela Merkel or someone else. So it's neither determined nor utterly random. It's not determined because it could have turned out otherwise. That is, you might have thought of a different female European politician. And it is not utterly random because, well, it had to be a female European politician. Another example need not involve memory, but might instead involve attention, where deciding in the frontal lobes to pay attention to, say, cars, would then lead bottom-up processing to function differently than it would have if those frontal cognitive neural circuits had decided to pay attention to people or horses or houses or whatever. It's likely that neuromodulators and neurotransmitters released into the synapse of to-be-influenced neural circuitry by such top-down neural circuitry will play a central role in altering neural excitability and synaptic weights. This will alter informational criteria that have to be met in order for the neuron to fire above its baseline firing rate in the future. This will alter the information processing properties of neurons and neural networks and realize a form of top-down informational causation in the brain. In the next section, we'll focus on a particular example of such top-down causation in the brain, namely volitional attention, and how it might be realized via neurotransmitter release from frontal and parietal areas down into areas that process sensory input in a bottom-up manner, such as the ventral stream.